So we all agree that The Chosen Season 3 was amazing. However, something has been bothering me over the last few months, and that is the timeline of The Chosen. Of course, this is from the Bible, a book of historical events that actually happened, mostly in Israel, but we get a lot of this timeline kind of mixed up and different things are happening in The Chosen. And while that is perfectly fine, they told us that they were going to do that in the very beginning, there are some things that just didn't make sense to me logically and I couldn't shake it. So I've spent the last 3 weeks really digging into the show, looking at every single episode of The Chosen, basically rewatching all 3 seasons, looking at the Jewish calendar and all the holidays just so that I could figure out exactly what is actually going on in The Chosen. Now, the results of this may actually shock you, but let's go over everything that I've found through my research in the last few weeks. Now, generally, we see the timeline of Jesus' ministry in history. We know that his ministry lasted from when he was 30 to when he was 33 and died on the cross, resurrected, and ascended. But in The Chosen, we know that he starts his ministry in AD 26 at some point. Now, some of these dates are kind of hard to track because we don't get exact dates in these little lower thirds that they give us in the show. When they do a flashback, we normally see a general year when that occurs, and then they bring us back to the present, which we know is AD 26 from the beginning of the series overall. Now, throughout the series, we have not gotten an update on that date at all. So we haven't had a lower third that said AD 27 or AD 28. And we know that we're getting closer to the crucifixion, but it seems as if not even a year has passed yet. So is that true? Well, let's look at a couple of different factors. There's a few ways that we can track the date all throughout the series itself. One of them is through the script, and the other is by the Jewish holidays. So let's start with the easier one and more concrete one, and that is the Jewish holidays. As the series starts, we know that we're somewhere within AD 26. Now, the script gets us a little bit more specific about where we are in that year, but we'll talk about that in a second. All throughout season 1, we don't really have any holiday appearances. You know, we see a Shabbat, but other than that, we don't really see any celebrations or feasts or anything like that. That is until season 2, episode 4, which we know as the Pool of Bethesda episode, where we meet Simon the Zealot and Jesse, and it's an amazing episode. But one of the biggest points of this episode is that they're celebrating the Feast of Booths, or Sukkot. Now, just like our holidays that we celebrate all around the world, these holidays happen at specific times of the year. So this gives us almost an exact date in AD 26 that we would see them celebrating Sukkot. In AD 26, the celebration of Sukkot would have taken place in Tishri 15 through the 21st. For us, we would know this as mid-October. Then we go through the rest of season 2 without seeing a major holiday and ending at the Sermon on the Mount. Then we begin with season 3. Now, season 3 is really crazy because it spans a large amount of time, even though it doesn't really seem like it. While we just celebrated Sukkot in season 2, episode 4, in season 3, episode 3, we actually start to celebrate Rosh Hashanah with Jesus in Nazareth. Now, there's some amazing things that happen in this episode, including seeing Lazarus and Mary and Martha, some of my absolute favorite moments. But we also would know that this would bring us almost a year ahead of time, almost to the date. Remember that Sukkot is celebrated in Tishri 15 through 21st. And then we would see Rosh Hashanah on the 1st of Tishri. But that would be the next year, and almost the end of the next year. So there must be a year that's missing in between there, so we'll check that out when we get to the script. While I don't mind The Chosen changing around events and moving timelines, it seems like a bit of a stretch to move the entire calendar around, so I'm assuming that a year would have passed somewhere within here. So that time jump for Rosh Hashanah would have put us in AD 27 now. And then there's no more holidays until season 3, episode 7, where we begin the episode celebrating Purim. This is a celebration of the book of Esther and the escape of the Jews from the evil hands of Haman.
13th day of the month of Adar. And on the 14th day they rested and made that a day of feasting and gladness. Therefore the Jews of the villages hold the 14th day of the month of Adar as a day for gladness and feasting, as a holiday.
Now, we know that this would take place on 2nd Adar, 14th and 15th, but this would actually move us to AD 28 as well. So that means that over 2 years has passed since the beginning of the series overall. That's a long time. So does the script agree with this or disagree with this? I went through every single episode of The Chosen, dissecting the script and trying to figure out how did all of this time pass? Because for me, it didn't feel like it had been that long, and it seemed as if there had been time frames in which they had told us were shorter than what they actually were. So let's take a look at the script. Let's take a look at some of these points where the characters actually talk about timelines and see exactly how long The Chosen actually has been going on. So have grace with me here as I go through the script and talk about all of these episodes. There are some things that I just don't have the answers for because it's not explained within the show. But there are some things that we definitely have answers for, and I think that we can come up with a conclusive time frame within The Chosen itself just through the script. As we begin the series with Mary Magdalene, we see a flashback and then a present-day version of her in AD 26. Now this gives us a clue as to what year we're starting in, and that's where we started everything with the holidays. But in the script, we can actually see exactly what month this is, or at least pretty close, because of what Matthew says in season 2, episode 1. He says,
"It was the 4th morning of the 3rd week of the month of Adar, sometime during the 2nd hour."
It doesn't have to be precise.
Why wouldn't it need to be precise?
Now in this scene in season 2, they are talking about the first time that they met Jesus or when they were called by Jesus. And I believe Matthew is talking about the date specifically when he is called by Jesus from the tax booth. But he also could be talking about potentially when the fish were caught and when he saw Jesus for the first time. So I'm not exactly sure what he's talking about here, but it doesn't really matter at the end of the day, since it gives us a pretty precise time frame to go by as we're tracking backwards. So if we're tracking backwards from the point that Matthew was called from the tax booth, that puts us near the beginning of the month of Adar. And most of season 1 is going to happen within that month of Adar. This brings us to episode 7, which really gets us to the start date of what Matthew gives us in season 2, episode 1. However, we know that episode 7 starts directly after episode 6 because Mary says, "I want to apologize for yesterday."
I wanted to apologize for yesterday.
For what?
I was trying to help those people get closer to the sound of your voice. I had no idea they would open the roof and disrupt your teaching.
And we also get the timeline for the rest of this episode in this conversation as well, as Jesus says that he has plans for dinner tomorrow night.
I have made plans already for tomorrow night.
Plans.
Yes, spread the word. A dinner party in the Northern District.
This being the dinner at Matthew's house, of course. Then we go through the rest of the episode, we see the meeting with Nicodemus on the roof, and then we also see the calling of Matthew. This is basically where everything starts for us. But we also hear Jesus say that we're going to have dinner at Matthew's house tonight.
I'm not welcome at dinner parties.
Well, that's not going to be a problem tonight. You're the host.
And that brings us to the season finale of season 1, where we see that it begins exactly where episode 7 left off, and that is in Matthew's house eating dinner. And then, of course, the season ends with them heading into Sychar for Jesus to do some ministry and for the woman of the well to tell everybody about him. Now, this brings us to season 2, where we get that information from Matthew about the exact date that he was called, but after that flash forward, we actually come back to the present day while the group is still in Sychar. There seems to be some sort of time jump here, but it can't be much. Fatina is still running around the town telling everybody about Jesus, super excited. They're not quite sure who he is, and they're learning from him overall. So this seems to be still a hype moment as Jesus is coming into town and sharing with them all that he has to share. Now this episode shows that they spend at least 2 days in Sychar, and then they head out in the wilderness, which brings us to episode 2. Episode 2 of season 2 is extremely important, where we meet Nathaniel and Philip, but there is a small time gap here as well. We're not exactly sure how long they've been in the wilderness or what's been going on. So let's be generous and give them a month here, right? Let's give them a long period of time where they've been out in the wilderness, kind of getting to know each other and doing different things that the show just doesn't show us. Now we see as 2 days pass in episode 2, and then it ends in Caesarea as Nathaniel and Philip have their infamous come and see conversation. Then the end of the episode ends with Jesus calling Nathaniel to follow him. An amazing end. And in the final part of the episode, Simon and Andrew walk in and invite Jesus to come and heal people in Syria because that's where people are gathering to see him. Now to get to Syria, depending on where they are in that area, it would take 2 to 3 days to walk there. So let's assume that it's going to take 2 to 5 days in order for them to walk to that general location. Now we see in episode 3 of season 2 that we begin with this massive one shot of everybody starting in line and everybody's getting ready. The disciples are kind of organizing everything for this healing and everything that's going on with Jesus healing in the tent. but we don't actually know exactly how long they've been there or how many days Jesus has been healing. It seems as if this is the first day and it's just a very long day of him healing people, but we don't exactly know the time frame here. We can assume a couple of days. We see all throughout episode 3 that there's one day that passes here and not much time passes beyond that, but there does seem to be a time skip in between episode 3 and episode 4. Now here's where things get a little bit tricky for me when it comes to the script. If we're looking at episode 4 of season 2, there has to be a massive time jump in between episode 3 and episode 4. Even if we're being generous to all the points before this, then most likely they would still be in mid-summer of AD 26. So here's where the first real discrepancy comes in. There seems to be about a 4 or 5 month gap in between episode 3 and episode 4. So I guess we can just accept that. It just doesn't seem like that's the case. So episode 4 of season 2, we start the Festival of Tabernacles, or Sukkot. Now this is a huge timeline for us because it gives us the exact date, which is Tishri 15th to the 21st, like we talked about before. So ignoring this discrepancy, we can continue on in season 2 and continue our research here. In episode 5, we see as Mary is actually picking persimmons, and this seems to take place at least a little while after the Festival of Sukkot. We're not exactly sure how long, but because she's picking persimmons and they're ripe, this would actually put us in AD 27, because persimmons, especially Sharon persimmons in Israel, don't actually ripen until about January through March, April. So that would put us in that time frame. Then by the end of this episode, we see that Mary actually disappears and leaves the group. Now from a later episode, we hear that she's actually gone for 2 days, and that's when Matthew and Simon find her and bring her back to the group. So we see that direct correlation into episode 6 of season 2, where Simon and Matthew have now found Mary and they're bringing her back to the group. And then we see the whole debacle with the Pharisees at the end of the episode. And this brings us to episode 7 of season 2, in which not much time has passed between episode 6 and episode 7. We know this because Andrew is still really upset with Mary about her leaving, and she's just now being integrated back into the group. Now this does seem to be a different campsite than we saw in episode 6, so they have moved somewhere else as they're preparing for the Sermon on the Mount and getting everything ready for that. But Jesus also mentions in this episode that they only have a few days until the Sermon on the Mount, so it can't be long from episode 8 either.
Now, a few days will be plenty of time to make sure everything goes smoothly.
And that brings us to episode 8, where that links us to season 3 with the Sermon on the Mount. Now, I never really had this issue with timeline before, but season 3 is where things really got kind of crazy for me, and it made me really distracted while I was watching the season overall. I couldn't really place my finger on it, but maybe this is why things felt so disjointed for me. So episode 1 of season 3 holds a lot of information that we can take to understand where we are in time. Of course, we begin with the Sermon on the Mount, so it's starting directly where we left off in season 2. But there's also some quotes that help us to understand where we are in the timeline. As Jesus is saying goodbye to everybody, he says this.
It's been quite a journey these last several weeks.
As Jesus talks about how it's been several weeks for them, is he talking about the entire journey? Because if that's the case, then from the beginning of their journey together through all the stuff that they've been through, it seems like there has not been that much time. He says several weeks here in the show, but in reality, in the calendar, it would have been several months, like many, many months since the beginning of the show. And then as Thomas and Rema have a conversation, they talk about how he's going to stop by tomorrow.
You're all set with Mary?
Yes.
Good. I'll stop by tomorrow to check in.
I figured you would.
This conversation makes me assume that everybody arrives in Capernaum on that same day, because they said that they would see them tomorrow after they've gotten settled into their new homes. This also offered up some questions for me, like why didn't Thomas travel with John and James from the Sermon on the Mount, since it was right there? There's no way that he could have gone home and then gone to meet John and James. Maybe he went and picked up supplies or something, but this was another thing that didn't really make sense to me in this frame. And also, I've talked about this before, but the travel time between Machaerus and Capernaum and the Sermon on the Mount would have been very much longer than it is in the show. It seems as if Andrew's teleporting back and forth and in between and having no travel time, or at least very little travel time, since there's only one day that passes in between the Sermon on the Mount, everybody getting home, and then eventually Matthew going back to his family the next day. Now we see as about a day and a half passes in episode 1 of season 3, bringing us to episode 2. Now we know that episode 2 starts off exactly where episode 1 left off, because we see as Matthew is in his house, beginning beginning that conversation with his parents. This feels a little bit off to me because of the way that some of the scenes were ordered in this episode. For example, the scenes right before Matthew's conversation with his parents, it seems to be nighttime and everybody's getting ready to go to bed in Tent City, but then in Matthew's house, it's clearly day. So maybe he slept the night and didn't talk to them, and then they had the conversation, but that doesn't really make sense to me. I don't know. So little things like that. And then we get a hint later on in the episode by Jesus as he says, take a day to handle what you need to, and then they're going to be sent out on their 2x2.
You all have a lot to take in. Take a day to handle what you need to handle. There'll be a few more details tomorrow. I'll have Simon reach out.
Now, I wasn't sure how long the 2x2 actually lasted, but we're actually going to get a big hint about this in episode 6 of season 2, so just hold on tight. Then we come to episode 3 of season 3, and this is where things kind of go off the rails. Now, I love this episode. We get back to Nazareth, but this is when we see Rosh Hashanah. So in order for us to get here, it would be many, many, many more months of time skipped. And it's not really communicated in the show that that's actually happening. And this is the part of the season where we pretty much lose all sense of time, except for episode 6 of season 3. So all the way through from episode 3, 4, and 5, we don't really get an indication of exactly what time period is throughout the year. But we do know they're connected because of episode 4 and 5 being together there and having the setup and conclusion in episode 5. Now, episode 6, we do get a little bit more clarification of where the time frame is in this season in particular. This is actually the one quote from this season that really made me begin making this video in the first place, because it made no sense to me at all. Now, as we get into episode 6 of season 3, we know that a lot of things have happened, including the healing of Jairus' daughter and the bleeding woman, and Eden has had her miscarriage. So there's a lot of stuff happening all at once. We know that Eden is going to tell Simon about her miscarriage at the end of this episode, but we also see John the Baptist's disciples show up and talk to John and James. Now, this is really important to our timeline because we actually hear as John tells us how long it's been since Andrew went and visited John the Baptist in prison. This is actually huge. He says,
"They claim to be disciples of John the Baptizer, that they bear an important message from John."
A message? Why wouldn't he have given it to Andrew and that woman from Herod's court? What was her name?
Jonah, Junior, something with a jar.
Joanna.
When Joanna snuck Andrew into prison.
Well, that was over a month ago. They said they cannot wait.
So clearly he says that was over a month ago, but not 2 months ago or 6 months ago, just a month ago. So somewhere in between 4 and 8 weeks. Now, Andrew visited John the Baptist in jail back in episode 1. So if we're granting 8 weeks of time in between that over a month period, then that would mean that within that 8-week period, we had to include all of Rosh Hashanah and everything that they've gone through season 3 so far. So that's a very limited amount of time. And it really breaks going into the next episode because it's insinuated that episode 7 is clearly right after episode 6, because we see as Simon is extremely upset about this news that he's heard from Eden. So while we could say maybe a couple days would have passed, there's no way that there's months and months and months of time in between episode 6 and episode 7, because it's not clearly told to the audience, and it just seemed really weird story-wise to have that be the case. And yet, due to the Jewish calendar, it kind of is the case, because Purim is what starts in episode 7, and this holiday takes place months and months and months after Rosh Hashanah and after everything that's happened in season 3. So the timeline really doesn't make sense within the script of the story itself. So I understand that this is a little bit confusing, so let me explain it with the timeline right in front of us so that we can all understand. As far as we know, running through the script, we see that the Sermon on the Mount and the time that Andrew goes to see John the Baptist in prison is in the beginning of AD 27. So that should be February, January, March, April, somewhere in there, somewhere in that time range. But it looks as if time is just skipping all over the place. And so as we get into AD 27, we fly down to Rosh Hashanah, which is in September, October, and then we fly down to March of AD 28. After that, getting to Purim. This is really the biggest piece of cognitive dissonance for me, since John tells us that going to Machiris for Andrew was a little over a month ago, but then also we're seeing that over a year has passed since episode 1 of season 3. So those two things don't line up for me, and it makes it very confusing to follow the timeline. And then ending off season 3, we also see that episode 8 is tied to episode 7, as Simon runs up to the group and the episode begins. They spend a few days out in the field as they're feeding everybody and preaching to everybody, and then the walking on water and all of that happens at the end. So that's my timeline overall. It really seems as if the entirety of the series altogether really generously would have taken about 20 weeks, maybe. And so for me, this was the huge disconnect that I had in season 3. And I'm not making this video to trash on The Chosen. I'm not making this video to upset anybody or anything else. There's just a cognitive dissonance that I had while watching season 3, and I could not figure out why. Why was I feeling this huge disconnect between the characters and the timelines and everything that's happening? And I think this is the reason why. So much time is passing in a way that time doesn't naturally pass. And the characters are contradicting what the calendar is saying. The calendar is saying that 5 or 6 or 8 or 10 months have passed, when the script is saying, well, no, only a month has passed, or a few weeks have passed, or that was yesterday. So it just seems a little bit off to me in the way that we're supposed to be experiencing time within the show. Am I saying that this hurts the show for me? No, not really. This is just my nerdy way of looking into all this stuff, and I never would have looked into any of this had it not been for The Chosen, so thank you for that. But for me, it is a little bit of an issue when I have to figure all this stuff out and it's not just told to me. Why haven't we seen a lower third at least with AD 27 and then AD 28? Because by this time in the show, we should be about 2.5, 2.25, 2 and a couple months, years into Jesus' ministry, which would mean that season 4 is the last year or the last section of Jesus' ministry on earth. And that season 5, we know that is Holy Week, so we kind of have a time frame blocked off there. I think that The Chosen will get more and more accurate with their timing as they get closer to these really strong historical events. But I think adding in so many of these different holidays, I know that we probably wanted to add them in, but there wasn't a great explanation for the time periods that would have happened in between. At least not that I can see. If I'm really mistaken, let me know in the comments and help me to understand exactly what's happening here. But from all the research that I've done, like I said, I spent nearly 3 weeks on this video. So I've done a lot of research and I've looked at basically every single scene of every single episode of The Chosen over and over again, trying to figure out how this works and what the actual timeline would be. But it doesn't seem to really match up for me. What are your thoughts on this? Do you wish that The Chosen had stuck to a tighter timeline, or do you not really care? Did you feel like season 3 was disjointed like I did, or were you perfectly fine with it and everything was just a 10 out of 10, absolutely perfect? Let me know. As always, I'm entitled to my opinion just as you're entitled to yours, and I'd love to hear it in the comments down below. Thank you guys so much. I hope you enjoyed this video, and we'll see you on the next one. Peace.